So we're back on the Spitfire. Now with the engine hoist sitting here, it's starting to look a bit serious. Let's get into it and we'll show you what's going on. So the reason I have the engine hoist out is because this has the GT6 engine in it. When you have a GT6 or a GT6 engine in a Spitfire, you have to lift the engine up a little bit in order to get the steering rack in and out. Now the good news is you don't actually have to disconnect any of the radiator hoses or any of that stuff. You can lift it up just far enough to get it in and out without disconnecting that stuff. So the steering rack is bolted right there. Now, when it has the original 4-cylinder in the Spitfire, the oil pan's back behind the rack. But with the 6-cylinder, it's way up here in front of the rack. It's actually so tight to the rack, height-wise, that they have that hump there in the oil pan to clear it. Without that hump, it would actually be touching the steering rack. Now, once I get the new rack in there, we'll actually show you just how tight it actually is. Now, I found with all the accessories, everything bolted in place, I had to think about how I was going to hook onto this thing. But with my little cable adjustable tilt lift thing there, I was able to come down, grab the top bolt on each side motor mount, and with this thing adjusted right, it doesn't put any tension of any real discernible amount onto the manifold on this side, giving me good clearance there, and it gives me just enough room here to go on to pull it up high enough and not worry about actually touching. And for those of you who might be wondering, yes, I put some jack stands under the back side here because as we try to take weight off the front, it could want to tip. That will prevent that from happening. So now let's talk steering racks. This is the rack I took out of it. This was the quick rack. And the quick rack is supposed to be 2.5 turns lock to lock according to the catalog. This is the current replacement standard rack, which is supposed to be 3.5 turns from all the information I've been able to find, which should make quite a bit of difference in the steering effort. Now, all replacement racks these days are made like this, which is the same as what this one was made, except this one had a nut on, had a taller adjustment with a nut on it, and this one, and now all racks are made like this without the nut on it. But just like this rack, this doesn't have the grounding point on it either. So you have to come up with your own solution to make that work. Well, the solution that I come up with is a solution that maybe not everyone is capable of doing, but this is what I decided to do. This here is actually a 10-gauge steel piece that's welded on here, where this is actually a cast aluminum piece, which is basically swedged on there. So I didn't want to try to drill into any of this because I don't know how thick any of this casting is. And I was originally going to just drill through here, but it was hard to get the drill in here unless you have a really good, like small right angle drill for tight spaces. So my solution was to just add this tab on here. I could easily just TIG weld that across there without building and transferring much heat through here, and I could cool it and everything. So we'll take the ground wire that was originally over on this side, which is this, that the previous owner had made up, and I'll just transfer it over to this side and just put it here and hook it onto the screw holes on this side for the oil cooler, where it was just hooked to the screw hole on this side, so it would just go to that screw and it'd be just fine. But when you're hooking up ground wires to stuff like this, always make sure you put a little star washer underneath of it, because then that will bite in to the metal and ensure that you get a good ground. Now the other thing too is, before you install any kind of rack, because like in this case here, you're going to have to hook it to the splines before you can even bolt it down. You got to put this in the center of its travel. So you need to turn this back and forth all the way to the lock on one side, then all the way to the lock on the other side, and count how many turns it is to verify it, and then find the exact center. Now in my case, I got these nifty little sockets here that are specialty sockets that's supposed to be gripping all kinds of stuff. It just happens to fit this really nicely to be able to spin it and turn it lock to lock. Now this section here is an FYI, just for people who are looking at steering racks. This is supposed to be 3.5 turns. It's not. This rack here is actually a little under 3.25 turns, lock to lock. This rack here is supposed to be 2.5 turns. It's not. I took it back and forth, and it was actually about 2.75 turns, almost 2.75 turns, which means this one's not quite as quick of a rack as they're advertising, and this one's actually quicker than stock. So the difference between these two is actually just over a half a turn, not a whole turn like we're expecting when you're buying it. So if you're somebody who needs to replace the rack in your GT6 or Spitfire, and you're back and forth between, should I go with the standard rack or should I go with the quick rack, this information of knowing what you're actually going to get coming out of the box will be helpful for you to make that final decision. Because I always say the more informed you are, the better decision you can make, and you know what you're actually getting now. But of course, this could change if they change suppliers again on these things. So Rob from the future here, after reviewing the footage and doing some double checking of a couple little things, it appears that this particular quick rack is an older production part from about 10 years ago. And see, it has the nut here. The current one doesn't. So apparently the production's been moved to a different supplier. So when you actually get that one, the new ones that you buy today out of the box, it may or may not be exactly the same number of turns as this one here. So the current ones might actually be a little closer or right on 2.5 turns rather than the 2 and almost 3/4 that this one is. I just wanted to clarify that because I don't want to give you bad information. So now I got the engine sitting in place. Now the rack still has to be adjusted a little bit yet and tightened down, but that's how tight it is to the oil pan and why they had to do a bump in the oil pan there to clear it. So now that we have the new rack in the car, we gotta get the tie rods over. These are darn near new, so we're gonna just reuse them. So just like changing tie rod ends, if you were just changing tie rod ends, just mark these things and spin them off, count the number of turns, and then put them on the new rack with the same number of turns, because the rack, in theory, should be exactly the same length. So that should put us right in the ballpark for setting the front end once we get this thing back on the ground. Oh, so when I took these off, I had 14 turns on this side and 9.5 on this side. I was definitely not expecting that thing to pop off quite as quickly as it did, which means when they put this in, it wasn't quite centered and they had the splines off. So since I've got mine centered, then what I'll do in this case is start out with a middle dimension on those, and basically take 14 minus 9.5, do the division, and that's something like a roughly 11.5 turns, and do them both to that instead as my starting point. Now, like I said in the last video, I'm not exactly a fan of Autolite plugs. Now, I have switched out the plugs in the car to NGKs, which is considered to be a much better plug by pretty much everyone. But I'm also not a fan of Fram filters, which is what was on this car. And it just so happens that Fram and Autolite are made at the same company. Take that for whatever it's worth. I know that came probably on that oil filter conversion kit, because when you buy those kits, they come with Fram already in them. And I'll use it maybe for the first time, then I won't use Fram anymore. I tend to prefer to use Wix or Purolator, depending on where I'm actually shopping and what they have in stock. Now, one of the biggest reasons I don't like Fram is I've done a lot of reading over the years and videos and stuff like that of oil filter tests. And I have yet to see an oil filter test where they rated Fram filters anywhere but the bottom of the list. They usually rate even store brand filters as better than Fram. But most store brand filters are actually usually made by either Purolator or Wix anyway. They're just have less pleats in them, so they won't last quite as long, so it's their lower line. So do your own research on that one. If you've been using Fram and you like them, I don't think they're going to blow up your car. They're not that bad that they're not going to filter and blow up your car. Almost any filter on the market in the US today is going to be just fine for, like a 3,000 mile oil change or something like we're doing on these anyway. But I prefer to go with better filters for the same price. So tip of the day for you thrifty British car owners, which I know quite a few of you are, don't discount places like Menards when you need some of their supplies, like wiper blades, all your spray chemicals, cleaners to clean the cars up with, oil filters, even oil and batteries. They can be surprisingly cheaper than going to the big auto parts stores. Now, on oil, they do have Valvoline VR1, usually in stock, which is what we like to use, and which a lot of people like to use in these. But oftentimes they only have the straight weights in stock. It's very spotty from store to store what they actually keep in stock. And when you do find the multi-viscosities, often you won't even find enough on the shelf to do one oil change. So that's not so great. But batteries is another thing. You can save a ton of money on batteries, but they got a very limited selection. Like, you're not going to find a Group 26 battery like we use in the MGBs when we're doing a single battery conversion. They don't have those in stock. But for some of the other cars like the Spitfires, which I think is using the same battery as the Hondas, and anything with a Group 24, yeah, you can go in there and get those there. So they do have Purolator oil filters in stock, and they're like $3 a filter cheaper than going to any of the big 3 auto parts stores. So just a quick tip of the day there for you.